In 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler was working south of the Great Central Plaza at Cahokia, Illinois, when the soil began revealing something that did not fit the peaceful image many Americans had of the continent's ancient past. Fowler's team had located a small ridgetop mound, now known as Mound 72. At first, it looked like one more earthwork among dozens scattered across the Mississippi floodplain. Then the graves appeared. Human remains, carefully arranged bodies, shell beads by the thousands, men and women buried beside objects brought from hundreds of miles away. And deeper inside the mound, mass burials containing people whose deaths appear to have been anything but ordinary. Eventually, archaeologists documented the remains of at least 270 individuals inside Mound 72. Some were honored. Others may have been killed as part of ceremonies whose exact meaning disappeared centuries ago. Even the most famous burial in the mound would later turn out to have been misunderstood for decades. And Mound 72 is only one piece of Cahokia. Around AD 1050, something happened here that transformed a collection of settlements into the largest pre-Columbian urban center north of Mexico. Monumental plazas were leveled, enormous timber circles appeared. A 100-foot earthen pyramid rose above the floodplain. A 2-mile wooden wall eventually surrounded the center. Copper was hammered into thin sheets in a specialized workshop. Immigrants arrived from distant regions. Then, within only a few centuries, the population collapsed and the city ceased functioning as the center it had once been. There is no surviving Cahokian written account telling us exactly why. What remains is earth, bone, charcoal, pottery, pollen, lake sediment, post holes, and 12 mysteries that still refuse to become one simple story. Cahokia sits east of the Mississippi River near modern Collinsville, Illinois, across from St. Louis. The protected historic site covers roughly 2,200 acres, but the ancient urban zone spread much further. At its peak around AD 1100, Cahokia covered thousands of acres and may have supported roughly 10,000 to 20,000 people, depending on how archaeologists define the city and its surrounding settlements. Around 120 mounds may once have stood across the landscape. Monk's Mound alone rises about 100 feet and covers roughly 6 hectares at its base. UNESCO calls it the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the New World. Quick second before we go deeper. If you like investigations, where the unsettling part comes from what archaeologists can actually prove, hit subscribe. It costs you 1 click, and it helps me keep doing the research behind stories like this. Now back to Cahokia, because the first mystery begins before the mass graves, before the wall, and before the city should have become a city at all. The first mystery. The city appears almost at once. When archaeologists compared houses, pottery, settlement density, monuments and construction phases from the 11th century, they found something difficult to explain through slow urban growth. Before roughly AD 1050, settlements existed throughout the American bottom, but the scale was different. Then came a transformation so abrupt that archaeologist Timothy Porketat famously described it as Cahokia's Big Bang. Population surged, older communities were reorganized, monumental construction accelerated, and people from different cultural backgrounds appear to have converged in the region. Some demographic reconstructions suggest the dense central area jumped from only a few thousand inhabitants to well above 10,000 within decades. The discovery did not happen with one dramatic shovel strike. It emerged as generations of excavators opened house after house, and researchers placed radiocarbon dates, ceramic sequences, and settlement maps beside one another. Suddenly, the layers lined up. Cahokia had not simply grown bigger. Around the middle of the 11th century, its entire social landscape changed. Archaeologists can describe the transformation in extraordinary detail, but there is still no universally accepted explanation for what triggered it or how leaders persuaded thousands of people to participate. Religious revival, political consolidation, feasting, migration, astronomical events, new social identities, and combinations of these have all been examined. The timing is clear. The mechanism is not. What could make thousands of people reshape an entire landscape within a human lifetime? The second mystery. Someone rebuilt the ground itself. In 1997 and again in 2004, archaeological work associated with a roughly 1,200-meter utility corridor cut through Cahokia's Grand Plaza. Beneath what looks today like an ordinary flat field, researchers encountered evidence that the space was not simply a convenient natural clearing. Soil had been moved, depressions filled, surfaces leveled, and drainage apparently engineered to create an enormous central gathering place. Federal documentation describes approximately 40 acres of artificially filled and leveled terrain at the city's center. Imagine doing that without bulldozers, dump trucks, steel shovels, or wheeled earth-moving machinery. Every basket of soil had to be dug, lifted, carried, dumped, and shaped by human labor. And the plaza was only one construction project among many. Excavation has shown that its history was more complicated than a single building event. Archaeologists continue reconstructing when particular sections were leveled, how the plaza changed, and exactly what happened there. Recent remote sensing work has added new structures and sequences rather than reducing the place to one obvious function. No surviving Cahokian text tells us who ordered the work, how labor was organized, or what happened in that vast cleared space when thousands of people assembled there. You can stand on the Grand Plaza today and see Monk's Mound rising beyond it. But what were all those people gathering to witness? The third mystery. The largest monument is dirt. Long before modern archaeological mapping fixed its dimensions, 19th-century observers saw an artificial hill towering over the Mississippi floodplain. Later surveys showed just how extreme the structure really was. Monk's Mound stands about 100 feet high, with a base approaching 1,000 feet in length, and UNESCO describes its construction as a sequence of roughly 14 stages. It is not a natural hill. It is millions of baskets of selected soil assembled into a monumental platform. Excavations and soil studies revealed layers of different earth, evidence that Cahokian builders understood how contrasting soils behaved and repeatedly enlarged the mound. Yet that knowledge did not make the structure immune to failure. Parts of Monk's Mound have slumped, cracked, and shifted, and reconstructing the exact sequence of its construction remains difficult because excavating deeply into a protected monument would destroy the very evidence archaeologists are trying to preserve. That is the paradox. The largest structure at Cahokia is also one of the hardest to investigate completely. We know a huge building once stood on its summit. We know generations of labor built the platform beneath it, but we cannot simply cut the mound open from top to bottom. So what construction stages, offerings, architectural remains, or forgotten episodes are still sealed inside? The fourth mystery. The sun had wooden walls. In the early 1960s, archaeologist Warren Whittrey noticed unusual arcs of enormous post holes west of Monk's Mound. Individual pits did not seem extraordinary. Plotted together, they formed circles. Further excavation showed that Cahokians had built several large rings of timber posts over roughly 2 centuries. The reconstructed feature became known as Woodhenge because certain posts align with solar events, including sunrise positions used to track parts of the year. Cedar fragments recovered from some post pits helped establish what kinds of timber had been selected. Stand there around sunrise and the idea stops feeling abstract. A horizon, a circle of vertical posts. Monk's Mound visible in the distance. The changing position of the sun could be watched against fixed markers, connecting celestial cycles to the architecture of the city. But archaeologists still debate the full meaning of the timber circles. Calling them a calendar explains only part of what they may have been. Were they places of public ceremony, political theatre, agricultural scheduling, cosmological teaching? Probably some combination, but no surviving explanation tells us how Cahokians themselves understood them. Even more unsettling is how much wood has vanished completely. What we know comes mostly from stains in the earth where posts once stood. If those stains had been missed, an entire dimension of Cahokia's sky-watching architecture might have disappeared without a trace. The fifth mystery. The grave changed its identity. When Fowler's excavation of Mound 72 began in 1967, one burial quickly became central to interpretations of Cahokian power. Thousands of marine shell beads had been arranged around the principal dead in a shape interpreted as a bird or falcon. For decades, researchers commonly described the central burial as 2 high-status males, reinforcing models of male political leadership. Then scientists returned to the bones. In 2016, Thomas Emerson, Kristin Hedman, Eve Hargrave, Dawn Cobb, Andrew Thompson and their colleagues published a reassessment showing that the central arrangement included both male and female remains, and that earlier interpretations had oversimplified the burial. That revision matters because Mound 72 has been used for years as evidence for how Cahokian society worked. The objects are real, the beads are real, the elaborate graves are real. But the story constructed around them changed when the skeletons were examined again using improved methods. That should make us cautious with everything else. Archaeology does not reveal the past in one clean moment. It revises itself. Even one of the most studied graves in North America was not what researchers originally thought it was. If the identity of the central burial could remain mistaken for decades, what else inside Cahokia is currently sitting in a museum drawer under the wrong explanation? The sixth mystery. Some people did not die naturally. As excavation continued through Mound 72, the mound became darker. Researchers ultimately documented at least 270 individuals. Some graves contained high-status goods and deliberate arrangements. Others contained groups buried together. One feature held dozens of young women. Another mass burial included men and women deposited in ways that researchers interpreted as evidence of violent death. Earlier archaeological descriptions even raised the possibility that some victims may not have been dead when covered, although modern researchers are careful when reconstructing exact causes and rituals from skeletal position alone. And this is where the word terrifying can be used without exaggerating. Cahokia was capable of extraordinary architecture, long-distance exchange, astronomy, art, and intensive urban organization. It was also a society in which some ceremonial events apparently involved killing human beings. What archaeologists cannot reconstruct with confidence is the theology behind those deaths. Were the victims captives, retainers, community members, outsiders, or people occupying special ritual categories we no longer understand? Were the killings tied to the death of elites, political crises, renewal ceremonies, or cosmological ideas? Scientists can analyze sex, age, diet, injuries, and geographic origins. The meaning itself is gone. Tell me in the comments, does a mystery become more disturbing when we know exactly what happened physically, but have no surviving voice explaining why? The seventh mystery. Many Cahokians came from elsewhere. The breakthrough came not from a monument, but from teeth. Philip Slater and other researchers used strontium isotope analysis on human remains from Cahokia. Because strontium signatures in teeth can reflect the geology of the region where a person spent childhood, the chemistry can reveal whether someone grew up locally or moved into the area later. The results supported what the city's sudden expansion had already suggested. Cahokia was drawing immigrants. Some studies have estimated that a substantial fraction of the population was non-local during major phases of urban growth. Picture the discovery from the laboratory side. A tooth taken from a person buried 9 centuries ago is cleaned, sampled, measured, and compared with regional isotopic baselines. The result says this person did not begin life here. Multiply that across burials, and Cahokia becomes less like an isolated local chiefdom and more like a magnet pulling people toward the Mississippi from different communities. But isotope science usually cannot give us a person's name, language, motive, or exact hometown. Archaeologists can identify movement without recovering the story of the mover. Were people coming voluntarily for opportunity and ritual? Were marriages drawing families together? Were leaders resettling populations? Were some individuals captives? The chemistry proves mobility. It does not tell us what people felt as the city appeared on the horizon. The eighth mystery. Then they built a wall. During excavations beginning in 1966, archaeologists traced a massive line of post holes around Cahokia's central precinct. The pattern eventually revealed an enormous wooden palisade, approximately 2 miles long. The Cahokia Mound site reports that the wall was rebuilt 3 times over roughly 2 centuries, and that each major construction may have required around 15,000 to 20,000 oak and hickory logs, many about a foot in diameter and roughly 20 feet tall, set several feet into the ground. Think about the forest that represents: trees selected, felled, trimmed, transported, trenches excavated, posts lifted upright, thousands after thousands of them. And then the entire thing done again. Bastions along the wall are consistent with defensive architecture, yet researchers have also considered whether the enclosure divided sacred or political space as much as it protected people from attack. The troubling part is the timing. Cahokia's great urban experiment was already changing when fortification became important. Something made people invest enormous labor in creating a boundary around the center. Archaeologists do not have a written record naming an invading army. No surviving chronicle describes a siege. We see the wall. We see that it was rebuilt. What threat did the people behind it believe was coming? The ninth mystery. Copper was worked beside the mounds. In 1956, archaeologist Gregory Perino dug near Mound 34 and encountered an unusual patch of soil containing copper fragments and posts stained green. He suggested he might have found a copper working area, but the exact location later became difficult to relocate. Decades passed. Then archaeologists returned to Perino's notes and began searching again. Excavations beginning in the late 1990s recovered raw copper, worked fragments, charcoal, and debris that confirmed what Perino had suspected. Cahokia contained the first securely identified, specialized copper workshop known from a Mississippian site. Metallurgical studies show that Cahokian craftspeople could turn native copper into thin sheet through repeated cycles of hammering and annealing. They were not smelting copper ore in furnaces like old-world bronze workers. They were transforming naturally occurring metal through controlled mechanical and thermal treatment. The finished material entered a symbolic world of ceremonial objects whose designs traveled widely. Yet the organizational question remains open. Who controlled this workshop? Were copper specialists attached to elite households, ritual authorities, independent craft groups, or visiting artisans? We found the place where the metal was worked. We still cannot see the human institution standing around the fire. The 10th mystery. A road leads toward the dead. Archaeologist Sarah Baers tested a long raised feature running south from Cahokia's central precinct and demonstrated that it was deliberately constructed. Known as the Rattlesnake Causeway, it extended roughly 1 kilometer, measured about 18 meters across, and helped define Cahokia's urban axis. Most strikingly, it connected the central zone toward ridgetop mortuary areas, including the vicinity of Rattlesnake Mound. The feature had been visible in the landscape, but excavation revealed prepared fill and confirmed that people had intentionally built this broad earthen route. Later archaeoastronomical interpretations propose that the causeway may have symbolized a path of souls, perhaps connected conceptually with the Milky Way and a journey to the land of the dead. That interpretation is provocative and grounded in comparative indigenous cosmologies and spatial relationships, but even its advocates cannot produce a Cahokian text saying, "This road represents the Milky Way." That uncertainty is important. We know the road was engineered. We know where it goes. We know mortuary monuments occupy its southern world. We do not know what words were spoken when people walked it. Was this simply infrastructure, or did Cahokians build a physical road through their city that doubled as a road into the afterlife? The 11th mystery. The environment kept changing too. In Horseshoe Lake near Cahokia, researchers extracted sediment cores containing chemical traces of human occupation. One of the strangest tools for reconstructing Cahokia's population is fecal stanols, molecules associated with human waste that accumulated in lake sediment. Research led by A.J. White found that concentrations rose and fell broadly alongside archaeological estimates of population. The city's demographic history had left a chemical shadow in mud. The same environmental archives record episodes of changing precipitation and flooding, and other research has documented soil erosion and landscape stress during Cahokia's later centuries. Drought, floods, deforestation, declining agricultural productivity, disease, political fragmentation, and warfare have all been proposed as parts of the decline. But no single environmental catastrophe has been demonstrated as the universal answer. In fact, newer studies continue refining the chronology, sometimes weakening older collapse stories while strengthening more complicated ones. The city did not simply vanish when one bad harvest arrived. Its population declined over generations. So here is the harder question. What happens when environmental instability arrives at the same moment a political system is already under stress? The 12th mystery. Nobody left us the final explanation. Archaeologists found the decline not in one destruction layer, but in absence. Fewer houses, fewer monumental construction episodes, changing neighborhoods, rebuilt boundaries, abandoned spaces, population proxies falling. By the 14th century, the immense urban center that had dominated the region no longer functioned as it had at its peak. The Illinois state site describes Cahokia as occupied broadly between about AD 700 and 1400, with its great population peak centered centuries earlier. And here the strongest evidence may be what is missing. No Cahokian king list, no surviving inscription naming the ruler of Mound, no eyewitness account of the last great ceremony in the plaza, no document telling us why families departed, no single archaeological layer marking a final night when everyone disappeared. The people did not evaporate. Indigenous communities continued across the region, and scholars rightly reject old myths claiming Cahokia was built by some mysterious vanished race. But connecting later nations to specific Cahokian political identities remains historically and archaeologically complex, especially after centuries of migration, colonial violence, displacement, and cultural change. The city's political voice disappears before Europeans record it. What remains is a civilization speaking through post holes and chemistry. And there is one final discovery that makes that silence feel even stranger. Researchers recently revisited a massive timber known as the Mitchell log, recovered archaeologically from the greater Cahokian landscape. Radiocarbon analysis and strontium isotope work indicate that the enormous bald cypress was cut in the early 12th century, probably around AD 1124, and that the tree grew far from the place where it was erected. The log measured roughly 59 feet and weighed an estimated 5 tons. Its source may have been more than 100 miles away. Somehow, Cahokians moved it across that landscape and raised it as a monumental post. Researchers are still investigating what these great marker posts meant and why the tradition declined. That detail changes the feeling of Cahokia for me, not because it proves anything supernatural. It does the opposite. It makes the people more real. Someone chose that tree. Someone organized its transport. Crews hauled or floated 5 tons of timber toward a city where an earthen pyramid already dominated the horizon. Someone watched it rise. Children grew up seeing it standing there. Ceremonies happened around monuments whose meanings were obvious to the people present and almost completely inaccessible to us now. To this day, Monk's Mound is still there. The Grand Plaza is still there. The route of the causeway is still embedded in the landscape. Post holes from the timber circles remain underground. Copper fragments survive in collections. Human remains and funerary objects are subject today to modern ethical and legal responsibilities, including consultation and repatriation work involving native nations. The evidence has not disappeared. What disappeared was the living system that connected all of it. And that may be Cahokia's most unsettling lesson. Civilizations do not need to be primitive to become difficult for later generations to understand. Cahokia had engineering, specialized crafts, astronomy, long-distance exchange, mass gatherings, immigrant communities, political boundaries, monumental architecture, and rituals powerful enough to mobilize enormous labor. Then the network changed. Buildings vanished, posts rotted, mounds became grass-covered hills. Forest and farmland swallowed neighborhoods where thousands of people had lived. 900 years later, science can identify where a person grew up from the chemistry locked inside a tooth. It can detect population changes from molecules preserved in lake mud. It can reconstruct how copper was hammered, estimate how many trees a wall required, and date a single monumental timber to within a narrow window of time. But science still cannot recover every meaning. And maybe that is the part worth remembering. Cahokia is not terrifying because something impossible happened there. It is terrifying because something completely human happened there, on a scale most Americans were never taught to imagine. A city rose with astonishing speed. Its people remade the earth around them. They buried their dead with beauty and, at times, violence. They watched the sun through circles of timber. They enclosed their center behind thousands of sharpened logs. They built roads toward burial grounds, and then, generation by generation, the system came apart. So when you stand on Monk's Mound today and look across the quiet Illinois floodplain, what exactly are you seeing? The remains of a city that failed, or a warning about how quickly even the most powerful human world can become archaeology? Tell me which Cahokia mystery you want investigated deeper, and share this video with someone who still thinks ancient North America never had cities.